good day. I've been organising with colleagues here a conference on the subject of owning and disowning invention. It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Mario Biagioli of Harvard University, who's actually featuring in our conference. And I've had his permission to say that he's one of the world's leading historians of science. And you can see he's been a very busy man indeed in the last 20 years. A wide range of topics in his books alone, moving over the range of history of science, leaping over several centuries quite dexterously, and moving recently indeed into the topic of intellectual property and science, which is of course the theme of our conference. Once upon a time, I guess we historians of science used to know what invention was and what discovery was. What has emerged from our meeting so far, and we'll hear about more shortly, is that we're no longer quite so sure, perhaps, and engagement with history of science with patent law has revealed many interesting points thereon. It's kind of a window opening in the audience. Well, Mario right now at Harvard University, but I gather we'll be moving to a sunnier domain soon. But Mario, I look forward to hearing your talk on the subject of what has happened to discovery and invention, intersecting the discourse of patent law and science studies.
So thank you so much, Graham and Stathis, for inviting me. It's really great to be here and also to see how much interest is finally picking up in the history of science and history of technology community around issues of intellectual property. For the last 10 years, in the US, basically, Dan Kevles and I were, the only one who could have conversations on this matter. So it's great to see that actually there is a community building up. Graham mentioned that my institutional affiliation listed on the program is obsolete. He's right. As this summer I'm moving to the University of California, Davis, where I'll be in between the law school and the SDS program and establishing a Center for Science and Innovation Studies that I do hope will become one of the hubs of the history of science and technology and SDS/IP circuits. So my paper is about the history of the notion of invention. That is not the history of the inventive practices or of the inventor's representation of what their work was about and the kind of rewards that they deserved, but rather the history of how the law has defined the kind of things that could be patented. So since the early modern period, not only have new technologies yielded different kinds of invention, but the very notion of invention has changed too. So that is, looking back, I don't think that we see a single box labeled invention that contains all sorts of different inventions of different kinds. The box has changed itself. So both in popular literature and in history of technology and SDS literature, typically patented inventions are represented as things. Edison light bulb, Morse telegraph, Bell's telephone, and so on. So this is not the result of a kind of a cheap popularization, but it does reflect how traditionally patent law has conceptualized invention. So US patent law, for instance, connects the invention to the inventive step, that is the idea part of the invention, but this has to be reduced to practice, that is, it has to be embodied in some mode. So, in a sense, traditional notions of invention are, very close, I think, to the Aristotelian notion of substance. That is something that is made up of form and matter. Okay. So the form being the idea and the matter being the mode of reduction to practice. So until recently, there were no discrepancies, in my view, whatsoever between how the law conceptualized invention and how historians of science and STS scholars have discussed it. So a consensus, basically a consensus is that inventions are material entities. And this consensus, I believe, has survived the various methodological changes. That is, with the shift from kind of a device-oriented historiography to, say, Tom Hughes' notion of system, the materiality of invention has remained. Similarly, the shift to the social construction of technology school has not changed the materiality of invention. So materiality seems to be, the belief in materiality seems to be the axiom of our field, and actually, parenthetically, I would like to pose the question of why that's the case. That is, there are plenty of very sophisticated philosophical reasons to endorse notions of materiality, but I also suspect that as a field, we kind of recovering relativists, we cannot use the term, the R word, reality or anything like that. So materiality sounds much cooler, but effectively, it's like using the R word without using the R word. So what I'm saying is that I believe that there are both very good philosophical questions for a commitment to materiality, but there are also things that perhaps we should think about. At the same time, what's happening now, especially in the US, is that with the expansion of the notion of patentable processes to cover things like methods, algorithms, and business models, invention may cease to be exclusively associated with objects or with materiality. So a major case, the Bilsky case, was actually has been decided by the US Supreme Court literally a week ago on the 28th. And while it has affirmed the invalidity of Mr. Bilsky patent, and this is just to give you a little bit of reality effect about, how, in my view, insane this application was. So anyway, this hedging scheme by Mr. Bilsky was denied patenting, and the Supreme Court affirmed the decisions of the lower courts about this. But the Supreme Court did not close the door to patents of processes and abstract methods. Okay, so the story continues, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happened to this kind of this category of invention. So, if the trend toward patenting methods and algorithms is sustained, it will have, of course, huge financial consequences. It could be the financial industry equivalent to what genetic patenting has been to biotech. But it might actually have an even bigger impact because methods are by no means restricted to the financial industry. So these are crucially important issues, and I'm sure that we will hear much more about this in the future. In this specific context, however, I'm much more interested in the conceptual and philosophical rather than political and policy issues connected to these developments. I'm not saying this because I have no views on these matters, but just that my paper is not about whether or not I like this kind of business method patents, but it's more about what this trend is doing to the notion of invention. Okay? That is, how these developments are reframing the meaning of object, artifact, materiality, abstraction, tangibility, and property. And also, and unfortunately I will have to compress this part, I would like to see how these changes fit a longue durée history of notions of invention. And unfortunately, this part, the part about the longue durée history will need to be quite packed. So it seems to me, and I hope you will soon agree, that these highly technical debates are producing some interesting philosophical discussions about what technology is. Debates that unfortunately do not make major media venues, but they tend to be confined to patent attorneys' blogs and things like that. Let me show you, to give you an example of, if you want, the mundane philosophical issues that come up. So this is a transcript from the oral argument of the Supreme Court about the Bilsky case from last November. So Mr. Jakes is the attorney who's representing Bilsky. And so I'm not going to read through it, but the keywords that you should pick is like, look when Justice Ginsburg said, isn't that the basis on which the patent law rests in Europe, in other countries? They do not permit business method patents. It has to be tied to technology, to science or technology, right? And then Mr. Jakes say, of course, but no, right? And then, so basically here you see, look at the last quote from by Mr. Jakes. That's right, but they have also defined technology in such a way as to exclude business methods. And I don't think we can do that. The field of operations research, industrial engineering, and financial engineering, there has been an explosion in these particular fields, and now to call them non-technological because they didn't exist over 100 years ago wouldn't make, and then he's interrupted. So you see that, just to give you another example, this is Sotomayor. So asking the same question about how to handle this method patents. So how do we limit it to something that's reasonable? Meaning, if we don't limit it to inventions or to technology, as some of the amici have, or to some tie or tether to the sciences, to the useful art, then why not patent the method of speed dating? And this actually is a real concern. Right? So you see the beginning of, if you want, boundary work. Right? So these methods, are they technology or are they not technology? But if you accept them as technology, effectively you expand the notion of technology. Okay? So in very mundane ways, here you have a discussion about what technology is. By the way, the oral arguments are a blast. I mean, it's an acquired taste, maybe. but actually, they're actually quite interesting and very clear. And this is from the decision from last week that you see that, in a sense, the decision endorses the fact that these methods effectively are technological. Is that now there is a new age of technology, the information age, as opposed to the machine age, the industrial age. Right? So the machine of transformation test, that we'll get to it in the second part of the talk, is the test that is used to assess the patentability of processes. Right? So in this case, you say, no, effectively the tests that have been used so far, they work for machines, but they don't work for the products of the information age. So the road to Bilsky. Let me give you a very compressed trajectory of how we got to this case. So this part is, I am afraid, a little choppy because actually I counted on the Supreme Court to be even slower than it has been. In a sense, I hoped that I didn't have to rewrite the paper based on what they had said last week. So this is the definition of patentable subject matter in U.S. law. So the first paragraph is the current definition, and I've added at the bottom of the slide the older. So the first one that was introduced in the first Patent Act, 1790, and then the one in 1793. So focus on the notion of process. So if you see in the second line, you see any new and useful process machine. So process used to be art in the previous definitions. Okay. Now, when in 1952 the nomenclature, the term was changed, it was clear that the substitution of art with process did not expand patentable subject matter. That is, people said it's just a change of term. Process means art, means what in early 19th century or late 18th century meant by art. So that's the debate. The debate is about how you define that thing, process. Now, the patentable subject matter requirement is a threshold requirement. That is, it doesn't say that you're going to get the patent. It just means you have to jump this threshold, and then you have to fulfill the other requirements, novelty, non-obviousness, adequate specification, and so on. Now, this is the slide this is what the patent office, so this is more like a fleshed out definition of what process, machine, manufacture, composition of matter is. Okay, so this is not the law, but it's the patent office fleshing out of these definitions. Okay, and you see that process, an act of a series of acts or steps that are tied to a particular machine or apparatus to transform a particular article into a different state or thing. So process, and this is, by the way, this is exactly a contested statement. This is the point of view of the patent office. Okay, it's not. But you see that process is defined in very material terms. Okay. Now, there are exceptions to what there are things that you cannot patent. So these are things that are actually not listed in the law. I mean in the statutes, but they are the result of decisions. And again, this is the expanded. We have seen slides like this, yesterday. So it's not just abstract ideas, laws of nature, natural phenomena, but also mental processes and so on. Now, what is at stake in most cases involving this method is the fact that effectively there might be abstract ideas that are represented as processes. Okay, so that's a crucial line of demarcation. Processes, patentable processes, are defined as you have seen in the previous slides, but in some cases the critics would say you have abstract ideas that are not patentable, but they are turned into something that looks like a process by writing the patent claim in creative manners, like adding steps. So you're adding, steps to make an abstract idea look like, a method. So that's the crucial issue. Okay. Now, what has happened to this debate prior to Bilsky? So in the U.S., a case that is cited, all the times, and it's a very solid case, is the Deere case. That, for those who, I assume most of you know about it, but for those who don't, so this was an invention having to do with curing synthetic rubber. by having a number of temperature sensors connected to a computer, and the algorithm running on the computer was a well-known mathematical formula, the Arrhenius formula. The computer basically gets as input the temperature and modifies the gradient of cooling down of the rubber. So here you have something that is an abstract idea, okay, the Arrhenius formula, but it was declared patentable because it was attached to the computer, and the computer was integral part of a very specific solution, a very specific process. Okay, so it's a process that modifies the rubber, okay, so it has tangible effects on an article, and is embedded in a machine, the computer, which in turn is embedded in a bigger apparatus. Okay. So in this case, an abstract idea was considered to be patentable. Okay, so this is how you basically can take an abstract idea and turn it into something patentable. So this is established law. People at this point don't question this. So instead, what happened? So Deere was about 1980 or 1981, I don't remember. Then there has been a number of cases that have kind of eroded the strict standards about the patenting of process. The culprit, the case that is disdained the most by the critics is the State Street Bank. So the concept, without getting into a great deal of details, what happened with State Street is that the emphasis is moved away from the materiality of the process, and it's put on the materiality of the effects. Okay, so State Street had something. It was a system to facilitate the management of mutual funds. So what happened there is that, quote, a final share price momentarily fixed for recording and reporting purposes and relied upon by regulatory authorities and in subsequent trades is a concrete, tangible, useful result. Okay? So how we got here is not a physical material process, but the effect is deemed to be concrete and so on. Okay. So this is the logical and I think quite radical change. What has to be concrete is the result, not the process. Right? This opened up either the gate of paradise or the gate of hell, depending on where you side on this debate. So things like, by the way, a footnote, check out how nicely circular is the definition of process. Process is a process, or act or method that includes new uses of a known process. So this is a real patent. A method of inducing aerobic exercise in an unrestrained cat, comprising the steps of. Right? So you see here, there is no machine. Actually, there is a machine, the handheld laser, right? But that's not part of the patent, right? So the patent is not about the laser. It's about effectively directing an intense coherent beam and then selectively redirecting said beam. Right? So that's the method. Basically, do this. And for those who cannot visualize this beautiful, so the opening the gates for method patenting again is not just business methods. It can be anything. Now that was silly, but check this out. This is not silly. So this is a diagnostic method that basically says that you do a blood test following whatever technology you want. Okay? This is not about patenting a blood test. It's that once you have done the blood test and you look at the results, if you have a high level of homocysteine, you are very likely to have a vitamin deficiency. Okay? So here, again, there is no machine. I mean, there is a technology to do the blood work, but that's external to the patent in the same way that the laser was external to the cat exercising, invention, right? So here, the patent is on a correlation. Okay, you see the results of a blood test, and you relate them to a possible vitamin deficiency. This case, not only this patent was granted, but it was litigated, and the Federal Circuit upheld it. Then the case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court picked it up and then dropped it. Okay. So this is just to give you a sense of the kind of, or look at this. This goes back to the oral arguments, the Supreme Court in November. So you can read. What is important is that you see that the audience laughs, right? But then the answer by Mr. Jakes is that actually this could be patentable. Okay. Now, so what happens? What is the? So Bilsky, if you want, is the tip of the iceberg, and not a particularly interesting case. Now. So what is the response to this? So this is the Bilsky, and okay. So the Patent Office and the Federal Circuit is the specialized courts in the U.S. that handles IP cases. So they realized that, actually I assume they realized that the pendulum had gone too far on one side. And so they have done a pretty creative rereading of their own decisions to basically say that they really never meant State Street to be read the way people have read it. So they say that both the Federal Circuit, the Patent Office, and the Supreme Court always agreed that the test to decide whether a method is patentable or not is the MORT, the machine or transformation. So look at the 1 and 2 lines. So basically, in order to be patentable, a process must be tied to a particular machine or apparatus, or particularly transform a particular article to a different state or thing. Okay. So if the pattern is pretty clear. So you start out with a very material notion of process. Then with State Street and Allapat and other cases, the emphasis is put on the materiality of the effect rather than the materiality of the process. With the MORT test, they are reinjecting materiality into the process by saying that either it's attached to a machine, and if it's not attached to a machine, like say a chemical process that doesn't necessarily need a machine, it has to change, it has to modify matter. Now, and here things get, I think, interesting. Because even if, say, my heart, so to speak, is with this position, that is, I like the idea of trying to control and limit the crazy patterns that we have seen. Actually, when you try to apply this test, is a kind of a nightmare. Okay, let me show you. So this is actually the flow chart provided by the Patent Office to apply this test. But let me see if actually here. So this is from an amicus curiae brief by Lemley and others. And I think that actually they have a good point. That is, once you start looking at the specific thing, like what does it mean, a specific machine? What does it mean to transform something materially? Like, does locomotion count as transformation? Or does the collection and analysis of blood transform the object? Okay. These other things like insignificant resolution activity and a representative of physical thing have to do with specific cases. Okay, so, but basically, once you try to apply this test, you end up having to make all sorts of very qualitative calls that are, conceptually hard to make. Okay. So, to make things short, the Mort case makes people who are kind of how to put it, critics of IP feel good, but actually when you see the logical mess involved in this test, you realize that this is actually, perhaps, there is a problem in assuming that invention has to be material. Okay? So this goes back to the point at the beginning. We assume that invention has to be material. At least speaking for myself, I start seeing this trend toward the dematerialization of technology as basically a scam to produce more intellectual property. But then you actually see that in order to defend the materiality of invention, you start moving into some interesting conceptual quicksand. Okay, so the good guys don't necessarily have the good arguments. Okay, now what happened? How was this case decided? So the court kind of split. The majority said that Bilsky, does not deserve a patent. So in that sense, they affirmed what the other courts had said. But they say that Mort should not be taken to be the test. That is, Mort is effective, it catches all sorts of things, but it cannot be the test. The assumption is that there will be processes that would not pass Mort and should be patentable. Okay? So that's the key thing. They are not endorsing the material notion of process that Mort is effectively entailing. Basically, they said Bilsky doesn't deserve a patent because it's an abstract idea, and therefore it's not patentable. Now, the interesting thing is that in this decision, saying that Mort cannot be the test, it implies an emergent notion of technology. That is, we don't know how invention will look in the future, and Mort will not catch it. Okay. So the conservatives in the court, actually they happen to be the conservatives, politically they happen to be. Actually, they don't have, this is not a silly idea. That is, philosophically, it is, I think, quite sophisticated in the sense that you cannot define now what technology is going to be, and therefore what invention is going to be. Now, so they have this when they do history, because both all groups are buttressed in their position by basically doing pretty bad history. The majority has basically said, look, there was the machine age, and now there is the information age, and then there is going to be some other age after that. And invention will change not only the shape of invention, but the concept of invention will change along the way. Now, the minority, and these are the politically the good guys, Stevens, Breyer, Ginsburg, Sotomayor. So Stevens has written his minority opinion is much longer than the majority opinion, and he doesn't endorse this emergent notion of technology, and actually comes up with a history that basically says, look, there are kind of technologies, and business models have never been put in the category of patentable subject matter, and that's it. And so he writes a bad history, for instance, kind of finagling the fact that actually there have been a number of business model patents since the early modern period, having to do with insurance schemes and so on. Right? So, but his point, he uses history effectively to say nothing has changed. This business model, these methods were never meant to be patented, and that's it. So, in a sense, Stevens has a substantially more conservative notion of history than, say, what we would have. All right. So, some conclusions. So when I started this paper, I was pretty much convinced that I knew the line. This was clearly a pernicious development. The creation of more immateriality to be attached to property, blah blah blah. And I kind of have changed my mind, not in the sense that I am siding with Alito, Roberts, and the gang. I'm just saying that their arguments are interesting and they, create some serious crack in our confidence about the materiality of invention. Okay, I'm not saying I'm not saying that they're right, but I don't think that the people who are trying to defend the materiality of inventions have a good case against that. Now, a quick historical trajectory. How am I doing with time? Yeah? All right, well, so it really has to be short. So, in my view, there has been at least another moment where the notion of invention has changed drastically. And that has to do... So, let me do the comparison. In my view, early modern privileges really did not concern themselves with patentable subject matter very much. They were concerned at best with novelty, and novelty was local, was geographical novelty, was not absolute novelty, but there wasn't really much interest in what can be covered by privilege or not, because privileges were monopolies, and the issue of the object of monopoly wasn't really the point. You start having some serious discussion about patentable subject matter toward the end of the 18th century. The cases surrounding, James Watt's steam engine are a very good example of that new concern with patentable subject matter. So my point is that when inventions and privileges were seen as objects, and I mean this literally. My claim is that early modern privileges did not have anything intellectual about them. I mean, of course, the engineers had ideas. I'm saying that the law did not recognize the privilege as an object based on an inventive step. Inventions were things that performed a certain job in a certain place. So there was nothing intellectual about the privilege. So in a regime in which the privilege is not connected to an inventive step, but only to performance, there isn't really much discussion of patentable subject matter. The discussion of patentable subject matter comes in when privileges become patents, that is, they become rights. Okay? That's when the concern with the kind of things that you can patent emerge. So there is that first, in my view, discontinuity. And also it's a discontinuity that I think does something to the notion of discovery, but I'm not going to get into that. So, patentable subject matter is the result. There are conditions of possibility behind the emergence of discussions about patentable subject matter, and I think it has to do with the turn to rights and the turn to enabling specifications. The next step is that if you look at 19th century literature about patents, and here I specifically have in mind Robinson, the US legal scholar, you see that there is a struggle in the 19th century to define invention. So basically, it's not that now the notion of invention is in crisis now because of methods. If you do some careful history, you see that the notion of invention has always been unstable. Okay, and there have always been discussion about what is an invention. So, one of the example that I like, but I'm sure it's not the only one, I'm thinking about the work that Alan Pottage has done on the relationship between models of invention and notions of invention. So his argument is that models were not just used as evidence in the courtroom. Okay? So the jury or the judge cannot read patent drawings, so they don't see the invention in the text. So they need to be shown a little model to say, no, judge, this is the invention. Okay? They do that, but Pottage argues that the models actually become the model for the general notion of invention. That is, by, and this clearly applies to invention, 19th century invention that is mostly machine invention. I don't think that chemical patents will be covered by this. So the argument is that in the notion of invention as, let me see if I can find so the notion of invention that is emerging, at least the one that Robinson developed, is a coordinated movement of the various parts of the invention to produce a certain effect. Okay, so the invention is actually not static, is a coordinated process having to do with how the various parts of the machine work together to generate an effect. Okay? The model, the patent model, is actually, because it's a working model, by working meaning it moves, it becomes the model for that notion of invention. Okay? So, the notion of invention has always been unstable, and you get different models through which the law thinks about what invention is. Okay. So what changes is the conceptual model, but no model actually captures what invention is. So invention is always already unstable, but there are these devices to generate discourse about what the invention is. So, because I think I'm ending. What is happening now, I think, is just, if you want, a new stage of an old game. That is, invention has always been unstable. It's just that its instability has looked differently at different points in history. So, what are the lessons? So, there are really no lessons, I mean, as you know, being a historian. But I would say that in this case, the debate, the ongoing debate about method patenting, I think it forces us to reconsider our, unreflective, partially, sometimes reflective and sometimes unreflective commitment to a material notion of invention. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, indeed, Larry. I foresee a whole decade of conferences on that topic actually to come.
Right.
Now, we have 10 minutes in which Mario has kindly agreed to answer questions. Is that all right?
Sure.
So we may have a bit of an issue with acoustics. Try shouting your question out. If we can't hear you, we may have to pass you a microphone. But at the back there, please.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I am from the University of Law School. Thank you for that very interesting talk. About somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes ago, you said that the concept of invention starts to become problematic in the late 18th century with some sort of shift in the understanding of the patent right between rights and privileges. I didn't entirely follow that, so
Okay.
I'd like to ask you to elaborate on that. But then I want to follow up on that with a question about why do you see the concept of invention becoming problematic again now? Do you see a similar kind of conceptual shift underlying that, or do you see it as a technological shift? As the conservative plurality sees it with the information age. That was plurality, by the way, not majority.
Okay.
Justice Scalia did not
Yeah, you're right.
that
Scalia didn't endorse certain parts. You're right.
Right,
Yeah.
and that was in the part that he didn't endorse
Right.
it. So could you speak to what was going on in the late 18th century and how that compares to what is going on now?
So what I think is going on in the 18th century, and again, it's a big statement which requires some qualification, but and again, Britain is not a good example because the transition, the development is fairly continuous, so there are no revolutions. But if you look at the French case and the American case, you really have a very sharp divide between pre- and post-revolutionary periods. In the pre-revolutionary periods, the privileges are treated as gifts, so you don't have a right to a privilege. Literally you have to beg. For, I mean, the kind of the bureaucratic language is the one of you have to ask, and you do not find, by and large, enabling specifications. Instead, what you find are very, very strict compared to today, very strict reduction to practice requirements that are actually even more than reduction to practice. They are more like working requirements. So typically, you get a patent by showing either a prototype or a model. If you cannot show it, you have 6 months to 2 years to show the thing working. If not, you lose the patent. So I read this emphasis on very little disclosure. There is disclosure, but it's not enabling. Okay. I see the connection between little or no disclosure and strong emphasis on reduction to practice to basically say that the authorities are effectively rewarding the performance of this thing. Okay? And that's what I mean that there is no idea. Because I really think there isn't an idea. The invention is conceptualized as a lamp of, a chunk of matter that does certain things that are considered useful there. Okay? So, the inventive step, I'm not saying that there are no inventive steps in the mind of the inventors. I'm just saying that the law doesn't recognize that. Okay? When you move to the patents as right regime, you have the introduction of enabling specification, the discourse of the patent bargain. Okay? And at that point is where I think that the notion of inventive steps comes in as a result of the mundane step of writing down what the invention is. So I see a connection between requiring enabling specification and writing down what the invention is that constitutes what the inventive step is.
And what's the relationship of that to discourse about patentable subject matter?
Okay, that's tougher. I don't think it's very clear, but my guess is this. In the discussion of, a negative argument. In the previous period, there isn't the conceptual space to talk about subject matter because the invention is just a thing, and what matters is the utility of the thing. Okay. When you start having the discourse of rights and specification, you also have the discourse of the patent bargain. So you have a contract between the inventor and the public, and you start having the discourse of metes and bounds, the strong emphasis on novelty because you cannot have monopolies. So I think it's the concern about the avoidance of monopolies that creates a discourse about, okay, there are certain things that we can patent and there are certain things that you cannot. This is a guess. Okay, this is the second part. But that would be my best guess.
So that's what was going on back then, and how about now? Why is it problematic again now?
Well, so again, my working hypothesis is that effectively invention has always been tricky to define. It's just that the trickiness changes, in time. Now, if I understand your question correctly, you're basically saying, are you saying that it's a historical contingency that now, because there are these new technologies, there is a crisis in the definition of invention?
Right, I'm trying to understand. Is it about technological change, or is it about some other change?
So the first case that I explained, actually, there isn't really a technological change. It's more like a political change, right? Yeah. In this case, I would say it is a technological change. Yeah.
Just coming back on that, I mean, you're describing the pre-revolutionary period and the post-revolutionary period. You're talking about the guild system, the feudal system, and the shift to the market. But isn't what's changed now, just going back to your question, the shift from sort of dynamic economic development of the post-Second World War period, and then the real turning point would have been 1973, the oil crisis, and the subsequent economic stagnation. So, for example, recently reading Peter Drucker, the management guru, and he makes the point in 1969 in The Age of Discontinuity that for the American economy to continue to develop, it needs to innovate new products and create new consumer demand for a new market. But by the mid-90s, he doesn't see the potential for new products and productivity through manufacturing. He just focuses on the service sector and the service economy. So that's where I'd look to sort of explain the emphasis on patenting, is that the lack of dynamism within the sort of manufactured and productive sector of the economy.
But I think I've lost you. I mean, I understand the narrative that you're giving, but I'm not sure I can connect it to the discussion about patentable subject matter.
Well, I'm trying to situate the discussion historically.
Okay.
And say there's a key turning point in economic development, and that's why patenting has extended. So, for example, now patenting the actual years of patenting has increased. Is it like 99 years now? Where it used to be 10?
No. That's you're mixing up copyrights and.
Can I try something out on you? If you briefly look at a heap of aspirin, you see a heap of white powder. You don't know what it's aspirin.
A little more loudly.
Sorry, if you look at a heap of aspirin, you see a heap of white powder. You haven't been told it's aspirin. It's just white powder, chalk. If you go and look in a farmer's field, you'll find things which might have had some use 200 years ago, but everyone's forgotten what they are. My suggestion is that all invention is processing. It's only, in fact, you just quoted Robertson, it's only when something is in action that you have an invention. So why are you so surprised that people have the processes?
Well, so first of all, I agree. That's why I brought up Robinson precisely to make your point. Is that I think that even the patents, like say machine, that they look like objects and they have not been put in the category of process. In effect, the notion of invention inherent in the patenting of those machines is effectively more like a process than a thing. And I would say that it's almost like a visual, how to put it, a perceptual artifact that you look at the text of a patent and you think, okay, this is the invention. But in effect, it's a snapshot of a moving, a temporarily of a process. So, but instead you look at the text and you say, this is the invention, but actually that's only a frame, I think. So, but here I'm not surprised that, here I think I'm describing the debate more than saying this debate doesn't make sense. Because actually...
In this debate, the Supreme Court slapped the CAFC's hand and told them they had no right to set up such a test. There's no basis for it in law.
Yeah, because they used they represented the decisions of the Supreme Court as endorsing the test. So, in a sense, they had... The Federal Circuit had put a certain spin on the Supreme Court's past decision, and they didn't.
Okay, we've got 4 questions. So, Simon first, then down here, then down here, Chris.
Is it helpful to notice that this is one end of the spectrum measured by process and materiality? Because after all, at the other end of the spectrum, there are contestable patents, both in the US jurisdiction, a fortiori in the European jurisdiction, where the problem is not this is process and this is immaterial, but this is material and there's no process at all, which the spectacular examples are in molecular biology and genetics, where the cases are all focused on whether genes that have been sequenced have been transformed at all.
Yes.
If one, as it were, puts the story you've told this evening on that continuum, is it helpful then for the more general historical argument you want to remind us of?
Yeah, I think that this case, no longer the Chakrabarty decision is invoked a lot, but in a sense, the Chakrabarty is pushing the notion of patentability, in the direction of the products of nature. These method stuff are instead pushing it in the direction of another exception, meaning the abstract idea. So there are two. In a sense, there are two very similar movements, basically trying to push against the notion of non-patentable subject matter.
Do you think science studies is in trouble around the issue of natural objects as much as you think it's in trouble around immaterials?
I think that the Chakrabarty stuff is easier for STS to wrap itself around because it's really about, nature versus artifacts. So those are on our conceptual menus. I think that the stuff here is trickier for us.
I don't come from a history background or anything. I'm more like I come from a legal background. And I was just wondering, you've talked about the invention and its evolution and its problematic definition and conceptualization and all the rest of it. But I was just wondering, do we need to have a concept of invention? We've never defined what a copyright work is. Yeah. And we've got into trouble by trying to define what a trademark is in trademark law within the IP framework. Do we need to define an invention, do you think?
By definition, I think you're right. Definition is not the right term. What you see at play here are, local decisions about what is patentable subject matter or not. So they're not about an overall definition of invention, but they're about specific cases involving a certain kind of invention. Right? So it's really not. It's not about a general. What I'm saying is that I think that if you look at debates on patentability, debates about patentability are about what kind of inventions are allowed to be patented and not. So you can, by extension, you can see that as a kind of definition of what invention is, but that's not what the questions that are posed. The questions that are posed are, much more specific about cases. So you are right in the sense that I shouldn't be talking about definition. It would be more about protocols for decision making, like tests, like the more tests. That's more what they are what the discussion is. How do you test this? So I think that test rather than definition is what I should be talking about.
Okay, Danny.
Mario, thanks as always for a really provocative presentation. I agree with you. It should be no surprise that our ideas of invention have to be understood as historically contingent. But we need to inquire, I would suggest, into, it's not a criticism, but an attempt to enlarge the discourse here. We need to inquire into what makes things historically contingent. That is, what forces have been at work that lead to the presentation of Bilsky before making its way to the Supreme Court. And there are at least three considerations that I would say we need to take into account. One is the development of non-material innovations that have real-world consequences for how you measure markets, how you strategize everything that we have been living with, and that some of which have led to recent disaster in the financial markets, derivatives, etc. So this has been an explosive set of innovations that is a very recent vintage. Well, I don't know exactly, but 10, 15, 20 years, something like that. Secondly, it's in the nature of people who innovate things that they seek patents on or some kind of protection from them. Some can be trade secrets, some can be copyright, but some can be patents. And so there's a whole menu of opportunities that have come before the patent office in the last 15, 20 years to make these things judiciable. Okay? Which is to say then that you have to look inside the patent office and ask, how did the grant of these kinds of patents that makes Bilsky a case?
Yeah, but when you say look into the patent office, you mean look at the training of patent examiners, looking at the issues, or you're talking about also the logic of the law, because...
Right, the logic also, but as you well know, my own view is that patent law is always, just like everything else in law, a matter of political economy.
Yeah,
let me just finish, right? So that what kind of political economy have we been living with for the last, say, 20 years, vis-a-vis the perceived role of innovation and entrepreneurship in energizing economic development. Right? It's been very, very pro-innovation, pro-entrepreneurship, and pro-creation of incentives. And it's difficult for me to believe that the patent office, at least in the United States, in its examining process, has not been responsive to that political, economic, and surrounding environment. Which is then to say that the reason that that new definitions of what constitutes invention had come into play a role in legal discourse and making their way up to the United States Supreme Court are a result of these historically contingent forces that inevitably express themselves in the patent.
So, having built my career on patronage studies, of course, I agree with you completely. But what I'm doing here that is a little bit different from the work that I used to do is that I'm also interested in a sense, think of it as a game. So think about the law as a game that allows you certain moves and not others. And it's not that you can break the rules all the time.
You can change the law.
You can change the law, but you see, one example is that what I find very interesting conceptually is because I find intellectual property to be magic in the sense that I don't understand it. I mean, to me, the notion of intangible, the reason why I'm so obsessed about this is that I think that these concepts are absolutely weird. Okay? And that's what, and to me, that's the hook. Now, look at this passage. This is Judge Newman, who is a very, very smart and competent judge. Look at the conceptual slip. So this is, she wrote a dissenting opinion in when the Bilsky case went through the Federal Circuit, right? So she says, this powerful economic mood toward intangibles is a challenge to the backward-looking change of discourse ruling today, blah, blah, blah. If you look at her opinion, there is this fantastic slip. Okay, so we're talking about in intellectual property, you have the intangible, the inventive step, and the material, right? This is like, she's talking about intangible squared. So, like intangibles without the tangible, right? And she doesn't see a problem in this. And we're not talking a dummy. We're talking a major judge. I'm interested in this kind of things, like, whips. So in this kind of work, I'm more interested about the logic, if you want, the intellectual regime. Because for the rest, I completely agree with you. I mean, yes, the political economy, the interest, and all that kind of stuff.
Well, on that point of agreement, can I just say one final question? I think.
And then we go and celebrate some.
We do indeed, actually. Yes. Chris.
Okay, that's great. So my sense is that the materiality debate in 19th century American patent law actually plays out around a different question, and that's the distinction between principle and process.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of things going on there. One of them is this kind of classic tension that if somebody invents a new process like using hot air in a blast furnace, you don't want to limit them to a particular furnace to let them get the benefit of the patent. But at the same time, you can't just let them patent an idea, a total abstraction. So the courts wrestle with that for a long time. And then the use of they decide to make the distinction based on you can't patent the principle, but you can patent the process. But then the use of principle confuses people because they start thinking about principles of nature. And inventions, all these mechanical inventions use force or use heat. And there's this discussion about kind of whether you can patent things that have principles of nature or are principles of nature, and that kind of links to Simon's point. So I was partly wondering how you thought that fit in with your sort of the separate question of... so that's all the questions about scope, right? Questions about abstraction. It's not about what's a technology and what's a new field, but the stuff you're talking about is.
Yeah.
And the intersection, I think, is that in the Bilsky oral argument, the judges spent all this time asking about Morse and about Bell, which Morse is about the abstraction point.
Yeah.
And they didn't know why they were asking about them, they just knew they were important.
Yeah. Well, on the 19th century, I need to learn from you because I don't know enough to come up with anything tenable. But
Well, so just at that point, having a drink and discussing it further. Let me finally thank Mario for an excellent